So we're very thrilled to welcome Michael Nielsen today. He's a legend in computer science and one of the pioneers in the field of quantum computing. In fact, he co-wrote the standard text on it. And this document was actually listed in Google Scholar as one of the top 10 most cited physics books of all time, which is a pretty weighty distinction. And so right now Michael lives in Toronto, where he focuses his craft on writing. And so today he's going to speak to us on his latest book, which is entitled Reinventing Discovery, the New Era of Network Science. This book delves further into themes that he first explored in his book, The Future of Science. And so we'll have some time for a question and answer at the end. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Michael to Google. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here today. I was actually at a event at the Library of Congress a couple of years ago, so I was on Michael Nielsen, and there was also Mike Nelson on the same panel, which caused quite some confusion when audience members were directing questions towards us. So my talk today is about open science, which sits in roughly the same relationship to science, basic scientific research, mostly academic research I'll be talking about, as open source software does to the commercial software world. And so what I want to explore is the extent to which open source principles or style principles can be applied to the practice of basic scientific research. So I'm going to start off with an example where this has been done successfully. So the example starts with this man, Timothy Gowers. Gowers is a mathematician. He's actually one of the world's leading mathematicians. He's, amongst other things, the recipient of the Fields Medal, which is often called the Nobel Prize, compared to the Nobel Prize in mathematics. Gowers, in addition to being a Fields Medal winning mathematician, is also a blogger. This is not that uncommon, actually, amongst leading mathematicians. Of the 42 living Fields medalists, 4 of them, in fact, have started blogs. So that's about 1 in 10, which I don't know how that compares to the general population, but it's pretty good. Anyway, in January of 2009, Gowers wrote this very interesting post with the title, "Is Massively Collaborative Mathematics Possible?" And what he was proposing to do in this post was to use his blog as a medium to attack a difficult, unsolved mathematical problem, a problem which he said he would love to solve, completely in the open, using his blog as a way of posting his partial progress and his ideas. And what's more, he issued an open invitation inviting anybody in the world who thought that they had an idea to contribute to post that idea in the comments section of the blog. So he called this experiment the Polymath Project. Well, the Polymath Project got off to actually quite a slow start, in the first 7 hours after he opened his blog up for comments, not a single person wrote in with any suggestions. But then a mathematician at the University of British Columbia named Joseph Solomosi posted a suggestion. Basically, it's a simplified variation of the original problem, which he was suggesting. Might be a bit easier to attack. And then 15 minutes after that, a high school teacher, in fact, from Arizona, named Jason Dyer, wrote a short suggestion. And just 3 minutes after that, Terence Tao, also actually a Fields medalist, he's a mathematician at UCLA, posted a suggestion. And so things were really off and running at this point. Over the next 37 days, in fact, 27 different people would post 800 substantive mathematical comments containing 170,000 words. That's a lot of mathematics done very quickly. It was hard. Actually, I was following along. I didn't contribute substantively, but I was following along quite closely. And it was difficult simply to find the time just to read all the contributions. It was really going remarkably quickly. You'd see people, they'd propose an idea in a very half-baked form, and then often it would be very rapidly developed, sometimes by other people. Sometimes, of course, it would be discarded, but other times it would then be incorporated into the canon of knowledge. Gowers described this process as being to normal research as driving is to pushing a car. And at the end of the 37 days, he used his blog to announce that the problem had most probably been solved. In fact, a generalization of the original problem which they were attacking. They still had to go back and check that they hadn't made any silly mistakes. In fact, everything did indeed check out ultimately. and they wrote 2 papers based on it. It took months more to do all the cleanup work, but the back of the problem had in fact been solved at this point. Now, of course, the reason I'm talking about this Polymath project is not really so much because of the particular mathematical problem. It's not important because it solved a particular mathematical problem. It's rather important because of what it suggests. It suggests that we can use some of these sorts of tools as kind of cognitive tools to potentially speed up the solution, not of simple, everyday problems, but actually of problems which challenge some of the smartest people in the world. That's really exciting. These are problems right at the limit of human intellectual ability, and not just one particular problem, but perhaps broadly across many different fields. Now, of course, there are a tremendous number of similarities and differences to the open source software world. I'm going to talk not so much about the similarities. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the differences today, and in particular I'm going to talk about some of the challenges and the reasons why this kind of approach is not more broadly adopted within science at present. My focus today is certainly going to be very much on basic science. That's the tradition I come out of. I was an academic for 13 years, so that's where my focus will be. I realise it's a little bit different than Google's focus, but I hope you'll kind of come on this journey with me. So I want to talk about a second example now, partially to illustrate this idea that it's really a very broad acceleration that can be expected. So I'm going to talk about an example from a completely different part of science. I'll start again with a story involving a single person. It's this woman, Nita Umashankar. When she was 23 in 2003, I believe she was 23, she just finished up her undergraduate education at the University of Arizona in Tucson, and she went to work for a year in India, where she worked with a not-for-profit organisation to help young Indian women escape from prostitution. Depending on whose estimates you believe, there are anywhere between several 100,000 and several million women involved in prostitution in India. But what she found was really tremendously frustrating. What she found was that a lot of these young women don't have the skills to hold down a job outside prostitution. Right? So she went back to the United States at the end of her year, and after thinking about the problem, she decided to start a new organisation called the Asset India Foundation that would address what she believed was the core problem by opening technology training centres in India and providing these young women with training in technology and then helping them find placement with some of India's big technology companies. Well, it's 7 years later now, and they've opened training centres in 5 large Indian cities, and they claim that hundreds of young women have completed their programs and been found placement, which is great. What they'd like to do, of course, is to expand. In particular, they'd like to expand into some of India's smaller cities. And this poses many challenges, one of which is that some of the smaller cities don't have the reliable electricity which they need to run their technology training centres. So they've considered all sorts of ways around this. Obviously, this causes all sorts of potential problems for them. One of the things that they focused on is wireless routers to access the internet. And so they experimented with available commercial off-the-shelf wireless routers, available commercial solar-powered wireless routers, and they found that what was available was not suitable for their local needs. And the way they addressed this problem was, or have been addressing this problem, was quite interesting. They went to a company on the other side of the world, just outside Boston in Waltham, named InnoCentive. And InnoCentive is essentially a marketplace for scientific problems, an online marketplace for scientific problems. It's a bit like eBay or Craigslist, but instead of posting a description of your old furniture or your car or whatever, you can post a description of a scientific problem that you'd like solved together with a prize for the solution. Typical kind of a organisation that posts to InnoCentive will be somebody like Eli Lilly, for example. It's actually a spin-off of Eli Lilly, but many other similar organisations make use of it. This is probably their most famous challenge. It's a few years old now. It's to find a biomarker for ALS, and they had a $1 million prize. It's actually a bit unusual. That's a very large prize. More typical prize is $10,000, $30,000, $50,000, that kind of scale. Anyway, what Asset did was, together with the Rockefeller Foundation, they put up a $20,000 prize on InnoCentive for an InnoCentive challenge to design a low-cost, reliable, solar-powered wireless router that could be made with parts that were easily accessible to the people in India. So InnoCentive broadcast this out to their network of solvers around the world. They claim they have several 100,000 people in that network. Who knows how many of those are really actually active. The number who actually downloaded the challenge was 400. When I say downloaded the challenge, I don't mean looked at the abstract or whatever. That was certainly a much larger number. This is the really detailed description with all the IP provisions and a whole bunch of stuff like that. So this indicates some reasonably serious level of interest. 27 of those people submitted solutions, and the winner was a software engineer from Texas named Zachary Brown. So he had a few interesting hobbies or talents. One was that he was certainly, as part of his day job, an expert in Linux and other sorts of open source software and low-cost software. But perhaps more relevant, one was that at home, in his spare time as a hobby, he built homemade wireless radio networks. And he was working towards a goal of making contact with every country in the world. So that was property number one. The second interesting talent that he had was, well, he told me in email that actually when he was growing up, he'd been watching television one day and had seen solar panels being installed at the Carter White House. And he'd asked his parents what they were, and he was enthralled, that was his word, to discover that you could take sunlight and convert it into electricity. So as an adult, he was working on converting his entire home office, including his wireless radio networks, to solar power. So if there was one person in the world that you wanted to get working on this problem for Asset, he'd be on your shortlist at least, I think. Right? And all InnoCentive did was it provided a way of making that connection. So in some sense, what's going on, or what's in common between the Polymath Project and this Asset InnoCentive story, is that in some sense we already had, or the human race, if you want to look really broadly, already had all the expertise necessary to solve some challenging, important problem. And what these online tools did was they provided a way of activating that latent expertise. It was all there, it was kind of almost trivial, but they activated it. Or in other words, they connected the right expert to the right problem at the right time. Now that's very obviously true in the story I've told you about InnoCentive. It's also true in a way that's a little bit harder to see in the case of the Polymath Project, but if you actually read through the archives of the Polymath Project, you see a very interesting kind of a dynamic. Somebody says, here's my half-baked suggestion, and they can't go any further. But somebody else says, that makes me think of, and then somebody else says, that makes me think of, etc., etc., etc. That's exactly the kind of thing that goes on in any good creative conversation. But what's interesting about it to some extent is just that it's done at a much larger scale, right? And that's valuable because it means that you can bring in more expertise from more people from all over the world. In fact, these were people who would have had a very hard time getting together all in one room. So in some sense, what was going on was that they were restructuring of expert attention, or redirecting of it. Instead of Zachary Brown or the Polymath sitting at home doing whatever it is they would ordinarily do, working on their wireless radio networks, they were able to use their expertise in much higher leverage ways. So there's kind of an interesting broad general question here, which is how can we design tools which allocate expert attention optimally? I'm not going to say very much about this, but there's sort of a few interesting remarks. One is that there's an interesting technical problem, which is how to allocate attention where people have maximal comparative advantage, so that they're working on the right things. In addition to that very challenging technical problem, there's also an incentive problem, which is even if you can direct their attention in that way, if you have the technical tools, there's a question of, are they actually going to want to do it? So you want to align their individual incentives with this optimal allocation. And at some level, you can look at lots of different tools. Certainly, you can look at Polymath and InnoCentive, but lots of other things. I think about things like GitHub, particularly the issue tracker on GitHub, IRC channels for open source software projects, and many other things like this, are all partial attempts to solve this problem, or you can all view them through that kind of a lens, and I think it's interesting to view them through that kind of a lens. So I'm going to switch away from this topic. It's something I talk about much more in my book, but I don't have time to talk about today. I do think it's an interesting general way of thinking, treating expert attention and diverse types of expertise as a scarce resource and as though you have a resource allocation problem. Something I'll just mention this, something I've often wondered. You're really talking about designing markets here and whether or not there are connections maybe to ideas which have been developed around things like AdWords and whatnot over the last many years. I don't know the answer to that question, but I'd be interested in people's comments. Okay, new topic, or a slight change of topic. What I want to talk about is why scientists have been so inhibited in adopting many of these tools, and they certainly have been if you look broadly across the sciences. So I'm going to tell the story of a few failures of ideas that, in my opinion, should have succeeded, certainly more than they have. So the first one is a site called The Quickie. This was started by a grad student at Caltech named John Stockton in 2005. It stands for Quantum Wiki. It was an attempt to start a research level type Wikipedia for the quantum computing community. So his idea was to recruit people essentially to write almost a super textbook for the field. So it would be very rapidly updated with information about all the latest discoveries in the field, descriptions of the big open problems, people's speculation about how to solve those open problems, and so on. Good idea. I happened to be present at the workshop where it was announced at Caltech in 2005. It was very interesting to chat with people at that workshop. Some of them were extremely skeptical. This is a total waste of time. Why would you ever want to do that? But actually, quite a large fraction of people were very friendly to the idea, and some were extremely excited. You have conversations, and you could use it to do this, you could use it to do that, you could share experimental protocols, etc., etc., etc. You'd have these 5-minute conversation, and then say, well, so what are you planning to do? Oh, no. I don't have time to contribute. But geez, I hope somebody else will take the time to implement these brilliant ideas. And of course, if enough people think that way, well, it was inevitable that ultimately it would fail. I should say, by the way, I've picked this example partially because Mr. Stockton did a lot of things very right. He did not fail because he messed up. He seeded it with lots of the wiki with lots of very good material. He certainly tried to twist various people's arms so that they would contribute material. He did a reasonable job of marketing it, and so on. It did not fail just because he'd messed up. And you can repeat this story across many similar science wikis. They often contain lots of great content contributed, but it's always contributed by just one person, or maybe one person with one or two buddies. And that's a very typical kind of a scenario. So you look at the Knot Atlas, kind of similar. The String Theory Wiki, very similar. And there's actually many other similar stories. I should say, when I say they failed, I'm just talking about in terms of their goal of recruiting a large number of contributors to collaboratively build this. They're actually often big successes in terms of lots of people want to access these sites. The download statistics are often pretty impressive. But lots of people want to read the content. They just don't want to contribute anything. Okay, so similar sort of idea. I've just picked a couple at random, scientific wikis and scientific social networks. This is kind of the Facebook for Scientists idea. So the notional idea being to connect scientists to other scientists with complementary interests so that they can share code, share data, share ideas, and so on. And there's been a lot of money poured into developing these. There's, I don't know, maybe several dozen of them. I've just randomly picked a few. And you create an account on such a site, you log in, and typically what you find, at least what I've found, is that they're often virtual ghost towns, right? There's just nobody there, as far as I can tell. And again, it's not because it's a bad idea a priori. Often they've been well done, well executed, but people don't want to use them. Okay, so let me just get a drink. What's going on here? As I said, that's just two of many examples. I'm going to move away from the slides for a second here. So what's going on is kind of obvious, but it bears spelling out. Particularly if you're a young scientist, although there's variations on this that are true for all scientists. Particularly if you're a young scientist, you want to get a job doing what you love, And you know what that entails. It entails working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, working towards the kind of things that are going to get you such a job. And this does not mean making contributions to the quickie. If you have to trade off spending 200 or 300 hours, writing 1 or 2 really mediocre scientific papers that nobody's ever going to read, versus spending the same time making a long slew of really brilliant contributions to the quickie or a scientific social network or whatever, like, there's no comparison from the point of view of your tenure committee or of the grant agency. Clearly, you should spend your time on that mediocre scientific paper. So, that's the straightforward career calculus there. And it is certainly the case that if you, even if you believe wholeheartedly in the power of something like the quickie, if you believe that that's the best invention since sliced bread, it's still a very hard thing to ask, to spend a whole lot of time on it. It's kind of tantamount to career suicide, right? So that's a really strong incentive for people to stay away from things like this. And I'm talking about what are the reward structures? What types of contribution are going to be rewarded? Is it simply writing papers and getting grants, or will the scientific community value other types of contribution as well? So what are the incentives there for? What are the rewards there for? So I'm going to talk a little bit about changing the culture so that people start to take seriously the idea of using some of these new tools so that they're incentivized and rewarded. But first of all, I want to address just one little sort of side issue. You might say, how does something like InnoCentive or the Polymath Project fit into this story? Well, actually, it fits in just right. If you look at something like the Polymath Project, yes, it's certainly an unconventional means which is being used, but at the end of the day, they've written scientific papers. That's the output, right? So it's an unconventional means to a conventional end. In that sense, it's a conservative project. Where you contrast it with something like the quickie, where it's not building towards, a paper in any sense. You are simply contributing to it for its own sake. And InnoCentive, well, there's an even more basic motivation. You're looking for a cash prize. It's kind of a really direct version. Okay, so I want to talk about 2 cases where, in fact, the culture has changed in really significant ways. So the first example concerns the Human Genome Project. So, actually, does anybody here have a background doing sort of genetics sequencing? Okay. So, are you familiar with the Bermuda Principles, this kind of thing? The Bermuda Principles? Okay. So, it's kind of ancient history at some level now. So, if you go back to the early 1990s, it becomes very clear, or it's very clear certainly to people doing doing sequencing, that the human genome is going to be sequenced sooner rather than later. It's just a matter of time at this point. But if you look at online databases like GenBank, where you can upload the data, there's a real question about why would a scientist actually choose to upload their data to such a database? At some level, it's a little bit like contributing to a site like Quickie, right? It's not something necessarily at this point in time that your tenure committee, they're not going to really care. Right? It's not a paper. You're simply helping your competitors. And this is very clear to everybody who's involved, right? That there's not a whole lot of incentive to do this kind of data sharing, but nonetheless, it's clearly in the community's collective best interest, certainly in humanity's collective best interest. So there was a meeting in Bermuda in 1996, convened by the Wellcome Trust, and amongst the people present were the leaders of the Human Genome Project. Craig Venter, who would later lead the private effort to sequence the genome, was present. Representatives from the Wellcome Trust were there, and representatives from the US NIH were there. And so they sat and talked this problem over for several days. And basically, what people were willing to agree was that, yes, they wanted people to share the data, but they weren't willing to unilaterally go first themselves and do it. So they wrote what are now called the Bermuda Principles, which they basically state 2 things. One was that if you took more than 1,000 base pairs of data, that data should be uploaded to GenBank or a similar site within 24 hours. And second, that the data would be put into the public domain. And it wasn't just an empty agreement. What happened was that actually the representatives from the NIH and from the Wellcome Trust went back to the grant agencies, and within 12 months, they were baked into policy at the grant agencies, which meant that if you wanted to get money to work on this, you needed to agree to abide by the Bermuda Principles. Right? So it's a good way of causing a big collective change in the behaviour of that community. There's actually a lot more that's happened since then to ensure that human genetic data is broadly shared. There's been several follow-up policies from several major grain agencies. Another notable thing that happened, for example, was in April of 2000. Clinton and Blair issued a joint statement, essentially in praising the Bermuda Principles. They don't actually name them, but they describe them broadly, and urging that every single country in the world adopt similar principles. And so this is a nice story, but of course, human genetic data is this tiny, tiny fraction of all human scientific knowledge. Even if you just look at other types of genetic data, the situation is much more patchy. A biologist of my acquaintance who's done a lot of open source work talked to me after he approached me after a talk, and his comment was that he'd been sitting on a genome for an entire species for more than a year. Okay. So that's a whole species of life whose genome is undergoing bit rot on his hard disk somewhere, purely because his collaborators haven't gotten around to running the appropriate analyses. And of course, there's lots more knowledge of that kind broadly across science. When I give talks, sometimes I will ask at the start, how many people, to scientists, how many people systematically share their data? Not how many people will respond to an email request, to send an Excel spreadsheet or whatnot, but how many people actually systematically share it? And except in a couple of fields, invariably, then 2 or 3 people in the audience will raise their hands, or sometimes none. It's a very small fraction. And more broadly, in most parts of science, not just data, but also code sharing, the situation is all over the map, but it's not particularly good. And then there's a whole lot of other knowledge, all sorts of tacit knowledge, people's half-baked ideas, questions, and the observations that are really the raw input, often the most important raw input to scientific papers, remain locked up inside people's heads in laboratories and are not actually being shared broadly, where they can be used by other people and built on in the manner that we saw in the case of the Polymath Project. So I told you that I described 2 stories of a cultural shift towards a more open scientific culture. The second story is much bigger than the Human Genome Project. But I have to go all the way back, in fact, to the dawn of modern science. So I go back to 1609. It's December. Galileo has built his first astronomical telescope. 7 months pass. For whatever reason, he doesn't look at Saturn during that time, as far as we know. But on the morning of July 25th, in 1610, he points his telescope at Saturn for the first time. And what he's expecting to see is a little disk. Right? That's what he's seen when he's looked at other planets. But actually, he doesn't see a little disk. He sees a little disk, and it's got 2 noticeable bumps on either side. And what he's seeing is, of course, the first hint of the rings of Saturn. His telescope actually doesn't, it's not quite good enough to really resolve the rings. That would have to wait to Christian Huygens some years later. But he knows straight away that this is a monumental discovery. It's kind of hard to think at this point, how can that be a big discovery? But of course, our knowledge of the heavens had barely changed since prehistoric times at this point. Right? So it really was. It was a big thing to have learnt. And does he announce this to the world? No. What he does is he writes down a description of the discovery in his notes, and then he scrambles the letters into an anagram, and he mails that anagram off to 4 of his astronomer colleagues straight away, within a day, including Kepler as one of the people. And what he's ensuring, right, is that if Kepler, say, later makes the same discovery, Galileo can reveal the anagram and claim the credit, but in the meantime, he hasn't disclosed anything at all. And of course, it's not just that Galileo was a bad guy or whatnot, but this was common at the time. Leonardo did it, Galileo did it, Huygens did it, Newton did it. Robert Hooke revealed Hooke's law in this way, which you may remember from high school. Right? There was no incentive at the time to share information, and so people kept it secret as long as they could, or the incentives were certainly much less clear than they are today. At least today, it's in your best interest to publish a paper. So the standard, kind of scientist way of looking at this is, we solved all that in 1665 with the invention of the scientific paper. But actually the story is much more complicated than that. In fact, the editors of the first scientific journals had tremendous difficulty in convincing people to reveal information. It took many decades. Right? So here's, this is basically Mary Bowers Hall. She was the biographer of Henry Oldenburg, who was the first editor of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, and she describes how Oldenburg would beg for information, sometimes writing simultaneously to two competing scientists on the grounds that it would be best to tell A what B was doing and vice versa, in the hope of stimulating both men, it was men at the time, to more work and more openness. She has these nice examples, two people working on essentially the same problem, and Oldenburg would kind of bounce letters backwards and forwards, sort of insinuating that the other one was ahead of where they really were at, in the hopes that this person would then feel that they had to say, I can do that too, and here's how. He would then publish distillations of these correspondences in the Philosophical Transactions. Funny kind of a way to be doing science. Another similar quote, this is Elizabeth Eisenstein, one of the scholars of the printing press. She's talking about late 1600s, so exactly the same time period, and she describes the way exploitation of the mass medium, books, was more common among pseudoscientists and quacks than among Latin-writing professional scientists who often withheld their work from the press. Well, this is 220 years after Gutenberg, right? It's not next week or next year or even next decade. In fact, it's not even next century. It's 220 years. That's the time gap that separates us from the French Revolution. And it really did take a major transition over many decades. So there's this interesting question. What caused the transition? Well, kind of the immediate thing you can say is that what caused the transition was somehow establishing a link between publication in journals and career success, the link that academics today take completely for granted, as though it's somehow holy writ. But no, there was a social process that went on there. But this begs the question, what actually really caused it? What underlay this transition? How is that link established? First of all, I should say that the transition did take certainly decades, in fact, arguably longer than a century. It's sometimes called the open science revolution. So to boil down, it's a very nice paper that's been written by Paul David at Stanford about how this happened. To boil his 120-page paper down to two words, it was patron pressure. So to explain what I mean by that, let me give you an example of patron pressure, more or less in action. This is my example, not David's, but I think it illustrates his point very well. The rings of Saturn was not Galileo's first big discovery. Arguably, in fact, it was the 4 Galilean moons of Jupiter, which was made, I think, in January of 1610. So what happened? Well, Galileo seized these moons, and actually he published that discovery pretty quickly. Not at all similar to the story of Saturn, right? He published a pamphlet. But before he published the pamphlet, first of all, he contacted several potential rich patrons, including the Medici family, and said, I will name these moons after you publicly if you agree to become my patrons. So here's Galileo's announcement. Notice anything about what gets the most... Basically, there are two things. There's the title, Sidereus Nuncius, which apparently stands for Starry Messenger. Galileo's own name is considerably smaller than this announcement of the Medicean moons. It's too bad for the Medici that we now call them the Galilean moons. They kind of lost out there. But anyway, the point is that the funders often have very different incentives. And in particular, the funders often have much more incentive for openness than the scientists do. The Medici wanted, they wanted the kudos that went with having this known for them. David's contention, and I think he's basically correct, is that in fact it was this fact, it was pressure from the patrons that ultimately caused this transition to the more open system that we do have today. Now it's interesting to think back now to my genome story, the Bermuda Principle story, and there's actually a strong parallel. The genome is open in part because of not patron pressure, but funder pressure, essentially the same thing. Right? It's not just funder pressure. The scientists involved certainly work together, but the ultimate governance mechanism was the fact that these people had a lot of money and the ability to withhold it if people weren't willing to share data in their greater good. So I would say certainly today that the grant agencies, the NSF and the NIH and other large grant agencies, there's a lot of potential for them to work towards much stronger open data policies than they currently have. It's not just the human genome data that they do have policies for. They have policies actually for a number of data types. But there's the real possibility to greatly broaden those policies and also to encourage people to share data much earlier in the discovery process. In a similar kind of a fashion, of course, there's a lot of valuable scientific information tied up in code, which is sitting on hard disks inside laboratories, and grant agencies could potentially work towards open code policies, particularly for critical parts of analyses or critical types, well, anything critical to the analysis. Another thing which grant agencies can do today, potentially, is that they can start to legitimise new tools simply by encouraging scientists to submit non-standard evidence of impact. If you're, for example, writing a job description, actually I'm switching from the grant agencies to an academic, if you're just writing a job description and you add one line that encourages people to submit non-standard evidence of impact, that will have a tremendous amount of impact. So that, switching back to the grant agencies again, it should be possible to use contributions to sites like Wiki or, say, uploads to GitHub as evidence of impact. I would go so far to say, I certainly believe that in fact publicly funded science should really be open science. Now, there's a lot of caveats to this statement. Just a couple. There certainly need to be exceptions for confidential and proprietary knowledge, but as a broad general principle, we can certainly work towards a world in which publicly funded science is open science. There's a tremendous amount of room there for people to move, and we're only moving very slowly in that direction. The reason I wrote this book is, at least in part, to make open science a public issue, and that I believe will serve two ends. One is to help encourage the scientific community internally to have a serious discussion about what types of contribution it values. Why is it the case that uploading data to some online database is, in most fields, not presently seen as part of people's job? That kind of question. But at the same time, it's also possible to have a public discussion of what type of scientific culture we want to support by public money. At the end of the day, the public is paying, by definition, for publicly funded science, and so they can have, or should have, some sort of impact. I'll just make a couple of remarks just about my own personal experience and what sorts of things I found useful to do as a working scientist. They're all very small steps, I should say, but I feel like these are things which many people could do. I certainly have made a point through my career, it's maybe not so unusual as a physicist, to make sure that my papers are freely available online. So about 80% or so of my scientific output is available freely online in some form or another. A little bit more adventurously, I've certainly explored using my blog as a way of conducting not just sort of science outreach or high-level discussions, but in some cases very detailed technical discussions at sort of a research level entirely in the open, with mixed success. I mean, something that continues to amaze me, I have several posts at, I guess, a very technical level, things like this series of posts on fermions and the Jordan-Wigner transform, which have tens of thousands of downloads. I'm quite sure who's reading it, but there's apparently a market, somewhat to my surprise. A little bit less successfully, well, something I've recently started doing, and it hasn't yet been all that successful, is uploading sometimes. So, for example, this is the version of this series of posts which I've uploaded to GitHub, so people can potentially contribute pull requests and fork it and so on. There's been a little bit of interest, but not a huge amount in doing that at this point. I'm also involved in a very minor way with the Polymath Project, hosting the Polymath wiki, but probably, in some sense, my largest single open research project, it's not exactly open science, was in fact the construction of my book over a period of 4 years. So using GitHub to bookmark all of my research which I did for it, which is then piped through to friend feed, which enables discussion around that. And so if you look in the background to my book, there's actually thousands of discussions with hundreds of people there, all done in a very sort of a super lightweight sort of a way. It totally transformed my experience, certainly, of writing, and was very useful. And parts of the book were also written in the open, insofar as my publisher was willing and able to allow that. Looking much more broadly at some of the organisations which are involved in doing open science work, one organisation which has done really tremendous work and is almost unknown is the Alliance for Taxpayer Access. So this is an organisation which has done a lot of work lobbying, particularly in the United States, for open access policies and open data policies. At the moment, they're trying to get the Federal Public Research Access Act passed. What this will mean is that if you receive funding to do scientific research from a US agency with a budget of more than $100 million a year, then within 12 months of publishing your results, it will need to be openly available online. Right? If that act is passed, that'll be a big deal. So the Alliance for Taxpayer Access played a major role in lobbying for a precursor policy, the NIH Open Access policy, which does the same thing for NIH-funded research. So over the next few years, in fact, in Google search results, when you search for biomedical things, you'll start to see a lot more papers, and that's really an outcome of lobbying done by them and other organisations. So I think that's a tremendous thing. Creative Commons, which many of you will know, but maybe not necessarily for their scientific work, have also done similar lobbying work, and they've worked also in particular with a number of companies to encourage them to share pre-competitive data. They've done some major releases, so they've done a lot of good work. And there are dozens of other companies I just mentioned, and organisations. I'll just mention a few here in case people are interested. And I'm very happy to chat afterwards in more detail. Just one final note, something I would love to see, which is something which I think Google could reasonably easily do, is that in fact, if Google Scholar, it's just an idea, I don't know how feasible it is, so many decisions are made in terms of hiring. I've sat in hiring meetings where people have their laptops out and they're searching through Google Scholar and looking for people's citation records and so on. There are some non-traditional forms of contribution which show up in Scholar results. I guess within physics, preprints tends to be the one that does actually occasionally show up in Google Scholar results. But there's the potential, I think, to start to include more non-traditional forms of contribution. I've seen a few blog posts show up in Scholar results. It would certainly be interesting if that was done more systematically, and potentially start a conversation within the scientific community about how seriously those kinds of contributions should be taken. Anyway, it's just a suggestion. I'd certainly be happy to chat about it more, and thank you all very much for your attention.